The room was draped in gold and velvet, a monument to the kind of wealth that makes men believe they are gods, and at the center of it all stood Marcus Thorne. He was the man who had bought the world, or at least he thought he had, holding a glass of wine that was worth more than a family sedan. He looked at the waiter, a man named Arthur Vance, and with a sneer that didn't quite reach his hollow eyes, he tilted his wrist. The crimson liquid poured over Arthur's crisp white shirt, staining his chest like a fresh wound. The 500 guests fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats as they waited for a reaction that never came. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't wipe his face. He simply watched, his expression cold and unreadable, as the man who believed he owned the future threw a final insult at him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Thorne was the kind of executive who lived in a world of high-altitude ego, a man who saw everyone else as either a ladder to climb or a rug to step on. His firm, Thorne Global, was on the verge of the most significant acquisition in the sector, a deal valued at $842 million. It was a transaction that would consolidate his power and cement his legacy in the halls of American industry. He saw himself as an architect of the modern age, building empires while others merely existed to serve him. His confidence was a shield that protected him from the reality of his own precarious foundation. He spent his days in glass-walled offices, surrounded by sycophants who whispered only what he wanted to hear, unaware that the ground he stood upon was already shifting beneath his polished leather shoes. Arthur Vance was a man who moved through the shadows of the corporate world with a quiet, calculated precision that few ever noticed. To the outside world, he was just another face in the crowd, a man who lived in a modest apartment and drove a car that had long since lost its shine. But Arthur held a secret that would eventually dismantle the illusion of Marcus Thorne's kingdom. He had spent years watching, waiting, and documenting the slow erosion of integrity within Thorne's organization. While Marcus was busy buying jets and decorating ballrooms, Arthur was busy auditing the truth. He knew that the massive merger was not a victory, but a desperate act of desperation designed to cover up a mountain of bad debt and fabricated success. He understood that when you build a house of cards, you only need one small gust of wind to bring it down. The night of the gala was the culmination of everything Marcus Thorne had worked for, or so he believed. He stood before the elite of the country, basking in the glow of the spotlights, feeling the weight of the $842 million deal pressing against his chest like a badge of honor. He had planned this night to be a public display of his dominance, a way to show his competitors that he was untouchable. He had specifically requested that the service staff be treated as invisible, little more than human furniture to be moved and discarded at will. When he encountered the man he thought was just a waiter, his arrogance took over. He wanted to show his guests that he could break a person just because he felt like it, never imagining that he was actually looking into the eyes of his own executioner. As the wine dripped onto the floor, the atmosphere in the ballroom changed. It was no longer a celebration of triumph but a moment of quiet reckoning. Marcus Thorne laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that grated against the nerves of those who knew better, and he made a comment about the incompetence of the help. He expected the man in the white shirt to apologize, to scramble, to show the submissiveness he felt was his due. Instead, Arthur Vance simply stood there, his posture rigid and his eyes fixed on Marcus with a stillness that was more intimidating than any outburst. In that moment, a strange realization seemed to ripple through the room, a collective sense that the power dynamic had somehow inverted. It was a flicker of intuition that told the attendees they were witnessing not a prank, but the beginning of an end. The following morning, the reality of the situation began to settle in for Marcus Thorne, though he remained oblivious to the catastrophe at his doorstep. He arrived at his office expecting to see the finalized papers for the $842 million acquisition sitting on his mahogany desk, waiting for his signature. Instead, he found his lead counsel pacing the floor, looking as if they had seen a ghost. The documents were missing, replaced by a single manila envelope. Inside were the true audit results, the ones that proved his entire operation was insolvent. As he flipped through the pages, his hands began to tremble. He realized that the signature required to finalize the deal wasn't from an anonymous bank, but from a private holding firm that had been quietly bought out months ago by none other than Arthur Vance. The panic that surged through Marcus Thorne was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He tried to call his board members, but the phones didn't ring, they went straight to a message that his access had been revoked. He frantically tried to log into his corporate accounts, only to find that the servers had been locked by an external administrator with complete control over the entire internal network. The man he had humiliated with a splash of wine was not merely a servant, he was the primary creditor who had been waiting for the exact moment Marcus was at his most exposed. The trap had been set years ago, and every choice Marcus had made to inflate his ego had only served to ensure his total destruction. The $842 million he thought he was about to control had evaporated into thin air. The downfall of Thorne Global was swift and absolute, unfolding in the public eye as a series of humiliating headlines. News agencies reported on the sudden collapse, the frantic attempts at asset liquidation, and the eventual arrival of regulatory authorities who stripped Marcus Thorne of his titles and his fortune. The board members who had stood by him at the gala were the first to distance themselves, issuing statements claiming they were victims of his deception. He became a social pariah overnight, his reputation dismantled by the very people who had once cheered for his success. He sat in his empty office, watching the city skyline from his window, realizing that he had spent his entire life building a monument that had no foundation, and it had taken only one man to prove that the entire thing was nothing but air. The legacy of that night remains a cautionary tale for those who believe that power is an excuse for cruelty. Arthur Vance eventually faded back into the background, his objective achieved and his quiet life restored to its original state. There was no grand press conference, no victory tour, and no gloating. He had simply balanced an account that had been left open for far too long. As for Marcus Thorne, the man who once looked down on everyone around him, he was left with nothing but the memory of a glass of wine and the knowledge that he had been undone by a man he deemed invisible. It is a reminder that the people we choose to overlook are often the ones who hold the most influence over our future, and that pride is the most expensive price anyone can pay for a moment of arrogance.